Meeting of the Governance and Policy Committee. Good morning, everyone, and thank you to those who are joining us via the live stream and those who are attending with us here in the boardroom in the Twin Cities. We have Regents Farnsworth, Kenyanya, and Rocha joining us via Zoom. The first item on our agenda today is our adaptive governance, which is up for discussion for the board today. As you know, in addition to our policy work, this committee has a broad charge to support effective governance. One way we can do this is by deepening our understanding of this topic. To that end, our first item of business today is a discussion of adaptive governance. The idea that in a rapidly changing environment, governing boards must be both collaborative and nimble. To encourage more of a free-flowing conversation today, I'd like to adopt a more relaxed work session style format for this item. Because we're not all in the same room, I'll still need to recognize speakers and those who've identified themselves to speak. But follow-up comments, additional dialogue won't need to go through the chair in the same way as normal. Also, you're welcome to use first names if you're comfortable with that during the session. With that, joining us via Zoom is Richard Beyer, Senior Fellow, the Association of Governing Boards of Universities and Colleges. Thank you so much for being with us, Mr. Beyer. Please feel free to proceed.
Very good. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. I believe we're going to have some slides. I was planning on speaking for about 15 minutes and then opening it up for dialogue. I think you all will have my bio and probably the slide deck in advance. So I will go brief through about 15 slides and then we can open it up. I'm also going to go off my video just so I can save some bandwidth and won't have any delays. So let's move on to the opening slide then, and just set some context for what I'll call transformation. And we'll talk a little bit about responsive and dynamic boards. We'll talk a little bit about an industry with systemic issues requiring transformation change, an industry with poor quality of earnings, some of the major trends in higher education, and then summarizing it all with the role of the governing board in transformation. Next slide, please. So if we just look at it at a very macro level, thinking about shifting our mindsets from inputs to outcomes. Lots of boards are focused on reports and a little bit less on strategic direction. And so boards in this era are going to have to be very strategic and very nimble and very collaborative because the market has changed and it continues to change in a rapid pace. So over to thinking about fixed and flexible, from fixed to flexible, to be able to understand the dynamic market environment. So if we try to think about 10, 20 years ago, the market is far different back then and it is far different today. And so thinking about from what's in our budget, what we can do to thinking about generative and what types of investments are going to be required to ensure long-term sustainability and prosperity. And just the concept from incrementalism to transformative initiatives. Next slide, please. So higher education, I use this slide a lot, as not immune to history. You can just kind of look around industries that perhaps we've been in, from automotive to steel to textiles. And higher education is going to go through the same kind of disruption and is going through that same kind of destruction. And there we're going to see a lot of failures in our marketplace, particularly in the privates, but you're going to see a lot of publics going through a lot of change. So just to know that we're just not immune from history. We look to history and then understand that higher education is right in the middle of what happened to publishing in automotive and steel. It perhaps can set some context on the journey forward. Next slide. And so market shifts, as we know, we've all been around our various industries, and market shifts have taken down many corporations, worth billions of dollars, even $100 millions of dollars, billions of dollars, and based on the belief that nobody can disrupt their model. the days when Motorola was the king of cellular, or Nokia and Ericsson literally went from, Nokia went from $100 billion valuation to virtually worthless. And on the belief that nothing could disrupt them. And so that what they all had in common was to hold on to what made them great, thinking that they were really better than they actually were in a new market, and just lacking what I'll call the institutional will and resolve to address the change. Next slide. And so thinking about transformational change, it really has to, when you think about it, is to go well beyond fine-tuning the status quo, tweaking here or there, particularly from a board perspective, that really need to, a part of transformation, really need to think about how you operate differently, and how deeply we think, and how it develops and implements strategy related to the marketplace. So it is far beyond just tweaking the edges. Next slide. And there is absolute consensus when you take a look at Moody's, who's had the fourth consecutive year of a negative credit rating on higher education as an industry. Just as an industry, it downgraded it 4 years ago from stable to negative, and has kept that negative credit rating. The last AGB trustee index, 89% of trustees were concerned or very concerned about the financial model. And the Gallup poll, latest Gallup poll of chief business officers, saying that higher education is in a financial crisis. And there are hundreds of institutions now that are at risk for closure based on the Department of Education financial composite scores. Next slide. And so these are just a few of the systemic issues that's going to help understand the need for transformational change. So you can see the massive debt, not only the massive amount of debt, but 43 million consumers with debt, poor quality of earnings, which really means the inability to reinvest, technology, on, and just in essence, an economic model that does not support continuous investments into functional areas that are critical to long-term success. Next slide. And the big are going to get bigger. So just a couple of instances here. Southern New Hampshire at 138,000 today. Their next milestone is 350,000 students. The president of University of Maryland Global Campus, basically at 91,000, students concerned about economies of scale, and basically planning to invest 500 million in marketing over the next 5 years. So again, the big will get bigger. Economies of scale will become an important part of education on a macro basis. Next slide. And we talked about quality of earnings. This happens in business. This happens without a doubt in education. But what we typically do is we understand why we have to balance a budget, but too often institutions are balancing the budget through continued underinvestment in critical areas. So we balance the budget, but we slow down or we eliminate new product development, or we're, privates are cutting their 403Bs, or we're not investing enough in fully investing depreciation, replacement of equipment, or technology, keeping up with technology. And so as an industry, we have a really, really critical issue in terms of quality of earnings. Next slide. And when we think about systemic issues, the campus-based financial model is broken. So it's just simply a high-cost model. I don't think we can think about trying to say, how can we get it to be a low-cost model? I think we need to accept it. It is a high-cost model, and our overhead is high. And so the net result is a continuous requirement, though, for external funding to subsidize the operating losses. In a business world, what you call an operating losses. So you balance your budget in higher ed through more fundraising and more external funds, because the campus model cannot sustain itself. And so when you think about transformational board discussions, it needs to think about a mindset far beyond a mindset of cost cutting, because cost cutting is not going to change it being from a high cost to a low cost model. So when you think strategically, it's going to be something else. Next slide. And that's something else is, a high cost, low margin campus model can coexist. but if there are corresponding low-cost divisions or market segments with higher margins. And so it is all about thinking about a more comprehensive financial model. If an institution has a 100% high cost model, it's going to be very, very difficult. But if they had a 50% high cost model and another 50% low cost model, then all of a sudden things start to balance out. But to be able to accomplish that, the good news is the industry as a whole just doesn't have strong institutional will and resolve. So those institutions who focus on transformation will basically outcompete 80% of the market because they just really won't show up. There's just a tremendous inertia to kind of hold on to the past. And so when you start to break out, you might wonder, well, how are we going to do in the marketplace? But the fact that you're breaking out on a particular issue or an opportunity that is strategic, know that 80% of the market or more is sitting still, and you should take comfort in that if you are, if you're moving forward. Next slide. And just some of the major trends. Shared services organizations are going to expand. Technology is going to play a significantly increasing role. The traditional student is now 24 to 35 years old. The shift from linear to nonlinear learning, from degrees to certificates and outcomes, being driven by corporations and consumers as well. The consumers are speaking with their feet. Consumers are not willing to accept a past practice of an industry in general that has been slow to change. That's why what you see in the other industries, you see new entrants, you see new divisions being started. And then finally, the consolidation of the market will continue to accelerate. Next slide. And so, getting back to kind of in summary, try to really understand your long-term journey and thinking about doing things differently versus better, and a mindset of prosperity versus sustainability. And it's always good to have some ad hoc committees, like even this ad hoc committee on strategic partnerships or strategic initiatives. Next slide. And then again, just kind of in summarizing, I've got one more slide after this about thinking about diversification of revenue, transformative investments. What are the investments that really could transform the institution? Obviously financial integrity, but much more sophisticated viewpoint about financial integrity in the future, and strategic issues. So all of these would suggest that to making sure that a board is 80% or more strategic, and 20% or less tactical. And my final slide, just kind of putting together context on the next slide, please, is the board absolutely should set the context, the compass, the strategic direction. Obviously with the president, clarity on roles is important, but also supporting the president when new policies are needed that align to the changing marketplace. There are a tremendous amount of policies that colleges have, institutions have around the country that are no longer meeting the market, yet there's so much inertia to keep those policies in place. So supporting the president when new policies have to be adopted are critically important. And the president really needs to feel empowered so that they can use the support of the board for transformational changes. So if the president's trying to move transformational changes forward, the board really needs to be behind the president. And then finally, the board needs to be, thinking about transformation, not incrementalism, and really continuously learning about the future trends in the competitive environment. And that'll help you just be a much more effective board. I'm going to stop my comments now and turn it back open for open discussion.
Thanks so much, Mr. Byer. As we give the regents an opportunity to gather their thoughts and whether they have questions or comments on your presentation, I wanted to start with something you ended with here, which is the concept of supporting the president. And the phrasing you used was to have a board behind the president. And we talked a little bit about this in our prep session for today. It's really more of a concept of the board in partnership with the president. right? And really both supporting each other in strategic initiatives, strategic change, and those kinds of activities, correct?
And
That you're
absolutely,
advocating for?
100% correct. And you cannot get to transformation without that alignment and that true partnership. It's difficult when you have alignment, right? And partnering, let alone if you don't. So it's so important. And then the president oftentimes can use the board because when the board helps with the president set that context on strategic direction, the president can be empowered then and confident about trying to make change because the board and the president are aligned and have that strong partnership.
Thanks so much. Regent Davenport?
Thanks, Cody. I want to follow up on your comment, and maybe if we could put what I think is slide 10 up. And it relates to this alignment that you just mentioned. Slide 10, yes. So this is where cuts mistakenly are often probably the most made. And it isn't just at the president's level that guides us, because it goes all the way down, and again, back to your comment about alignment, to the deans, to the department chairs, all along. And when we look at accountability along that line, where are you seeing universities provide that guidance, that training, that coaching? And then for us as a board, back to supporting and empowering our president, how do you see, well, I'll say how I see it. I think when we look at transformational change, that the provost has the dean's back, the president has the chancellor's and the provost's back, and we need to have the president's back, because these are hard changes to make. So again, back to that alignment, how have you seen that get implemented through the structure?
Yeah, and it's a really good, very good point and a very good question. We all know that it doesn't matter what industry we're in. We could be in our own industries. We balance our budget with the resources that we have. And you're right about alignment really, when everybody's pulling in the same direction, you get to have that alignment. But I think what this quality of earnings basically can help an institution with is set context on the journey, because further cutting is only going to make your quality of earnings worse. So what it does say is, as you do an analysis or a quality of earnings analysis, you could say, okay, we need to invest this much on an annual basis, not just a one-time basis. Now, some of that might come through because of the size of an organization, could come through reorganization or shared services or things like that. But I've never seen, I don't know if any of us can point to a major institution or a major corporation who has achieved greatness through just continuous pulling in and cutting. So it really will help you set context that you have to constantly focus in on your growth, because if all you do is keep your revenues about the same, operating revenues I'm talking about, it will become increasingly more difficult. And what happens then, the focus is, well, let's just go raise more money. Now that's definitely an option. But what happens is that is a model about, just think about what you could do with that external funding if you were able to grow your revenues and be able to address that prosperity gap through new initiatives. So while some of this for larger institutions, you may be able to get through some realignment, I don't think you'll get all of it through realignment. It'll still be needed to grow. So that slide 10 will help put context on your journey forward.
Any follow-up, Mary?
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Rick. Next, we'll have Regent Powell, Ken, who's the chair of our board. Rick, I'm going to try and give you a little bit of context with each person. I apologize. Mary's the chair of our Mission Fulfillment Committee. Ken is chair of our board just because you don't work with us every day. So Ken, go ahead.
All right, well, thanks, Cody. And first, thank you for organizing this discussion with Rick. I think it's really, really terrific. And it, we rarely have the opportunity to do this. And so I think it's great. Thank you. And it's very thought provoking. And and it's a huge topic. So Rick, I thought I would maybe give a couple of immediate sort of thoughts. They're kind of reactive, but I'll give them anyway. The first one has to do with, as we think about change, and you sort of gave a list of industries that have gone through convulsive change. I just think it's important for us to we shouldn't leap to the conclusion that we'll be like them, because we might be, but we ought to make sure that we understand what our strengths really are. And because there are things we just had the biggest entering freshman class in our history, or in a long time, for a lot of reasons, but we just need to make sure that we understand what is good about this model and what's strong and what's attractive, because all industries are different. And I think, Rick, as you said, this higher ed is a high touch model. And we just need to understand that and not be assumptive that we're going to look like Spotify or doctors are going to, learn online. I mean, there are a lot of things that they just won't happen. So we need to make sure we know that. The second point that I wanted to make that I really, really resonate with is the focus on strategy and trying to keep as much of the board's time focused on the strategic. I think that's resonant. And I think it's particularly important in our kind of institution where we have 60,000 students, 30,000 employees, like a small city, all kinds of activities. There are a lot of things that can go wrong. And there are a lot of tactical issues that need to be managed. And I think everyone on this board, you can get completely consumed by those kinds of things. And so your strong advice to do everything you can to stay focused on what will really advance. Anyway, it resonates with me. And the last thought is talking about cost cutting. I would push back, Rick, and tell you I think that's a loaded and sort of in a way, kind of a pejorative and a dismissive term, and no one in industry uses those words anymore. And it's more about, the fact is that just rethinking processes in transformational ways and just figuring out ways to deliver your service more efficiently. It's just critical. And, I can tell you about a lot of very, very high-tech transformational businesses that focus on process improvement every day. And it keeps them competitive. It isn't the answer, but I think that it's an important part of the model. And you sort of dismiss it as cost cutting. And I think you're missing it on that one. But anyway, so those are some reactions. I think this is really thought-provoking and a good discussion.
I think to follow up on your last point, if I can, really quickly, Ken. I hear it as the message that was really impressed upon me previously, which is you can't cut your way to prosperity.
Absolutely.
But efficiencies and opportunities and rethinking the way something was previously done, is there a more efficient, meaningful, cost-conscious way to approach it, is really where our brains need to start heading in these conversations.
Yeah, I agree with it. I don't want to over argue it, but just to say, if you just dismiss that area, everything else you do will be doubly difficult. I think raising revenue, absolutely, that's the long-term answer. That indicates that people are buying into what you're doing, but you can sink with an inefficient model, even if your revenues are going up.
Yeah, Ken, in this, I agree 100% with what you said. And so my point about cost cutting is, I would tell you that's what 90% plus of the industry does. It doesn't lower costs. So when you're talking about process improvement, and I'm a student of Edward Deming, okay? So, statistical process control, lowering costs, which has a much more permanent, effect. to the operation. And that drives productivity improvements. So that is actually lowering costs, which is 100% better than cutting. So, but even with that, you can, and as I was trying to say, the size of an organization such as the University of Minnesota, process improvement is definitely an opportunity there. I don't think it'll get you all the way. It'll probably, if you think about an 80-20 rule, might get you 20% there, and then you still have to have that growth. So I really agree with everything.
Fully agree.
Yeah,
fully agree with you. It's not the answer, but don't ignore it.
Absolutely.
Great. Rick, did you have any other reactions or reflections to Ken's comments?
Well, I think, again, he was talking about a strategy, and every one of those industries are different. So you'll have to, higher ed is totally different, but at the same time, we are going through some pretty substantial changes. I think it's when you look at it from a perspective of a state institution, the size of University of Minnesota versus, say, a private institution from the size of maybe a 3,000 student, institution. Those privates are having just tremendous problems, and we're going to see a lot more, closures in the future. So no, but I think, Ken, you're right on everything everything you said, and it is a high touch. And I think my point on a high cost model, even with process improvements and everything, it'll still be a high cost model compared to other forms of delivering education that is increasing. So I think it's just really finding the balance and thinking more strategically about, what the financial model looks like in terms of diversification of revenue, and to what extent you can find lower cost segments to be additive to your financial model.
Great. Well, on the heels of that conversation, Regent Mayron, who is chair of our Finance and Operations Committee.
Thank you. I really enjoyed the webinar and the slides, and really gave me an opportunity to step back and remind me about how important, yet again, strategic planning in this area is, and how exciting it can be. There are comments that you made that I think ultimately our board is going to have to decide if we agree with. For example, you have put out to us that we must accept that a high cost model, that higher education, the type that we deliver, is a high cost model, and in some sense stop fighting that. It's rather than trying to make it a low cost model, think about how are we going to most effectively fund that high cost model. I would subscribe to that, but I don't know that all the colleagues around this horseshoe and in attending by Zoom would agree. We've had many discussions about the need to lower tuition, et cetera. In other words, lower the cost of education. And I think at some point, probably earlier rather than later, we need to have a discussion about, is that truly the direction that we're trying to go? Because I don't think that will be sustainable for all the reasons that you talked about. But I think we have to reach agreement on that, or at least understand where we disagree. I think we also need to see if we agree that transformational change as opposed to incremental change is what is needed in this environment. And I realize that can get pretty esoteric, but I think it's important for us to see if we're on the same playing field, or whether we think we can do it bit by bit. I don't think we can. I don't think higher education can, but again, having dialogue with each other about, do we agree with that conceptually, I think will assist us in the direction we want to go. My question for you, Rick, is I'm always interested in best practices. And so I'd be interested, are there any institutions out there that you're aware of that you think are really have embraced the concept of transformational change and are doing a good job of addressing it? And if so, what is it they are doing that we could learn from?
Thank you so much. Let me address one of your comments, and then I'll also get to your question. I think with regards to the high cost model, I think where you can, and it goes back to what Ken was saying, I think you want to constantly look at process improvement, things like shared services that can help actually lower cost. But even after you do that, it will still be a high cost model compared to delivering with technology. And the market is looking for more and more technology to be delivered. And so this is an area kind of maybe I want to call it a natural tension, because technology and delivering of education via technology is going to increase dramatically. That's a massively different cost structure. And it can still be high touch using technology. But so just my point there. And then I think regarding the best practice, you just kind of, I think, probably look and draw upon what other maybe institutions or systems are doing. And it doesn't mean that it's, I wouldn't even know if it's best practices, it's just what they're doing. I mean, if you look at, for example, University of Arkansas, just acquired a for-profit college, okay? And the reason why they did that was they were basically inadequate in the areas of online delivery. And they not only picked up programming, but they picked up competencies, functional competencies, digital student marketing and digital student acquisition, as opposed to trying to do it themselves. They went out and acquired that. You look at what's happening in Pennsylvania now, it's a state system. There's a lot of consolidation going on in the state of Pennsylvania right now. Because they were, they believe that they could lower their costs, but it can't. It comes with a price through consolidation. You look at well, of course, in the New England area is really, really tough. I mean, the Vermont state colleges are going through massive changes. University of Massachusetts Global just acquired or just did a formal affiliation to control of Chapman University. So I think what is important is to learn about what's happening out in the marketplace on a continuous basis, and then see if you can pick up one or two things from each example, and then try to apply it to your own situation based on what you want to do and where your journey is where you're going on your journey. So but those are just a few.
Thank you.
Any follow-up?
No, thank you.
Next, Doug, who
Yes.
is Chair of our Litigation Review Committee and Vice Chair of this committee.
Thank you. Thank you, Cody, and thank you for the presentation, Rick. And I too enjoyed the online webinar that you did. I thought it was very informative. And I tend to agree a lot with what Regent Mayeron said, although I know we have to adapt and change, and we're going to be dead to the world. The question I have, or comments I have, are on the land grant mission status, where you're doing a lot of things that don't necessarily make sense now, but you have to have resources available for when you need them. For instance, in vet diagnostics, testing and stuff like that. You don't need that stuff every day, but when you need it, you need it. So it's not profitable every day. And that's part of our land grant mission. And then the question is I think the University of Minnesota can be competitive with anybody as long as it's a free market and there's not a lot of bailouts, there's not a lot of unknowns. And it seems like there's not a big appetite to close down colleges, whether they're private or public. So as soon as a college starts to go bankrupt or broke, somebody bails them out, and then the really strong ones don't get the bailout. So how does that play into the whole picture?
Yeah, that's a great point, Doug. I think time will tell, because I think, for example, let me just take a look at some of the smaller institutions. I see so many smaller institutions who are bullish, and the only reason they're bullish is they've gotten a lot of CARES Act money, and their model is just crushed. I mean, they have no chance, but yet they feel good because their bank account was bigger, and that probably has pushed off some of the consolidation. But I have to tell you, I know of many states where maybe the regional state institutions are just they need to close down or consolidate or do something. And that's why I point to Pennsylvania, because they're taking those steps, because there's just too much capacity out there. And but if you're right, if they keep getting prepped up, then there isn't really a free market, because it's just keeping places open. In the market is not really that as much free. So I think that time will tell. In time, and of course, you're a strong institution, And I think being in a position to know where the puck's going to go, right? Try to anticipate where the puck is going to be and try to say, how can we best position University of Minnesota to be in this area 2 years from now? Or it may not happen in 1 or 2 or 3 years, but we know it's going to happen. So how do we position ourselves in these particular areas so that as we start to see these changes actually happening, then we could, take advantage of it, for our own benefit.
Just a quick follow-up. The slide that you mentioned, I can't remember what slide number it was, but Maryland or somebody was spending $500 million in marketing.
Yes.
That's a lot. How are they deploying that much money? Are they just going all in, or what are they doing?
And that would be really on their digital, the digital online division. So the University of Maryland Global Campus. So many institutions have kind of split off new divisions to address technology and online and as that market really continues to grow. And so the student acquisition cost per sale is vastly different. Where in that market, institutions might spend 20% of revenue on student acquisition, and maybe in a traditional brick and mortar institution, they might spend 3 to 7%. So it's a vastly different particular model. So it's really focused on that global, University of Maryland Global.
Thank you.
All right, next up, Darren, who's vice chair of our audit committee. Rick, just for your benefit again.
Thank you.
Thank you, and I really appreciate this opportunity, and I think it's an important conversation, and obviously one that's going to continue well beyond today. I think that this is as I was watching the video and considering the topic, we really have almost a different approach to this topic for each of our system campuses. When you look at the Twin Cities campus, I think that when we talk about the cost and the demand, I think our Twin Cities campus is in a very strong position, with I think some cost or with some price elasticity that allows us to do a lot of different things, but that doesn't end the question for a public board like ours. Whereas some of our system campuses, we're in a big challenge, and I think price is a huge problem for us. And those you've heard me talk about that before, and I appreciate Janie, making reference to me without actually having to use my name. I appreciate that she introduces the dialogue, but I think a historical perspective is really important when we talk about this, for higher ed generally. I mean, if you look at the past 25 or 30 years for our system, our enrollment has been consistent. The demand has been consistent. The demand has actually even gone up, but we've had dramatically increased costs. It's just adjust for inflation, any number of costs, and you'll see that we have raised the cost on our students as a public good in a dramatic way. And a big part of it is guaranteed student loans. And I was very supportive of the concept of GSLs because they were going to be a renewable resource for allowing kids to get to school. But but if you actually go back and look at the numbers, it all just turned into additional cost. And so that's where you get that $1.7 trillion in debt on students across the country, because the boards and even AGB didn't stand against that development. I really enjoyed the video. I thought one of the most interesting parts of it was the discussion of the value proposition. But what kept coming to me on the value proposition is that it's not just the student's value. The state, the public makes a huge investment in public institutions like the university. And so you have to ask yourself, what's the public good? What is the public's interest in making a $500 million investment in the institution, let alone put forward all these assets that are public assets in our campuses and in our facilities. And the public's interest is represented by the Board of Regents. And so we actually, I think, have a duty to look at all sides of this equation, not just, we talk about the quality side, and I'll talk about that in just a second, but the public's investment it's intended to educate the public to promote, advancement of society. And ideally that happens without people being saddled with a lot of debt. They go out and contribute to society and so on. So, I think if we actually evaluate what's happened to the cost of the product that we produce over this time, I think that that will be informative of our ability to address some of those concerns. And, institutions like ours, we've got both public money, and we also have this large student demand for with tuition, especially on our Twin Cities campus, that allows us to sort of ignore that efficiency side over time, and it's put us in, I think, a difficult spot, because it's tough to rein that stuff back in, as you know. But and going back to the point Janie made about, I don't think I've ever advocated for a lower quality institution. I've advocated for our ability to continue to produce a quality product, but doing it in an efficient way that is respectful of the public's investment into the university. And if our position is, going back to Doug's comment a minute ago about how we compete in the market, well, we're competing in the, I would love to have a hardware store where, a substantial percentage of my inventory costs are subsidized by the government. We're not really in a market because we're subsidized. We're in a market, but it's not a true market because we receive a substantial subsidy. And if we can't, as a board, represent the public's interest in that value proposition of an affordable education, even a world-class education, which the university has produced for decades, then the state's value proposition would come from, just sending money directly to students, and then the institutions will truly be in a market where they have to compete for efficiency if they're going to try to attract those students and those state dollars. So anyway, I'll stop with that. Again, it's a continuing conversation, but the institution, my observation is that we're in very much the same place that we have been historically. Rankings, graduates of our key colleges, I think we're continue to produce a fantastic product, but we're just, the cost part of it is a real challenge. And as we see with those numbers in student debt, that's, there are a lot of things I'd like to talk about, but coming off of the previous comments, those are the comments I'll make today. Thank you.
Darren, let me pick up on one thing that you said. I think is really important. A lot of great things, but when you think about your system campuses and you talk about your demand increasing, but your actually costs are rising faster than the revenue growth, that right there, that when you think about the public good, okay, so if my revenue grows and my costs grow faster, then where is that public good? Well, where is the good for everybody? So I think this also goes back to what Ken was talking about, which, how do you lower your cost? How do you permanently lower costs? Just, cutting things, so let's cut, that doesn't have a permanency to it. So if things like shared services has a permanency, some consolidation of back-end services have some permanency to keep the costs down. So I think attention needs to be paid, and clearly coming from audit, when you put $1 of revenue growth, if you spend $1.10, I don't even know there's a public good there, right? But if you take $1 in and you spend 80, okay, that you're keeping your costs down, and that's helpful. So I think the incremental operating margin on growth is critically important as in terms of measuring that. And so it does in this situation, goes right back to what Ken was saying about how do you figure out how to lower your costs and versus cutting. So when I say cut costs, that's probably 90% of people just, let's cut here, let's cut there. And it may not have any permanency to it all. So really thinking more strategically about things like shared services, or things like, hey, but we have to do things differently because we can't get that productivity increasing, and probably without pushback as well. But you made some great points there. In terms of public good and revenue growth, but cost growing faster than revenue.
Thank you.
Next, Dave, who is Vice Chair of Finance and Operations right now.
Thanks, Cody, and thank you, Rick. Perhaps less of a transformational governance question here, an adaptive governance question, and more perhaps picking your brain as you watch this industry, and appreciate a lot of what you put together for the video and for today. But as I look at the biggest single macro challenge facing us in Minnesota, and I'm using Minnesota broadly, not just the University of Minnesota, is overcapacity over, you know, the next decade to decade and a half to 2 decades, as we think about demographics and our friends at Minnesota State having 7 regional campuses, us having 4 in addition to the one we sit at, and then a plethora of private colleges, which you've made several comments about. Are there any models out there we can look at? Any states that are actually getting on this wickedly difficult challenge of using data and using what the future looks like and getting their arms around the fact that we probably have more public and private schools in most states, not all, but most, than we can afford? Because Doug touched on it, Ken touched on it, several others have as well. It's hard to sort this industry out if the capacity we have today is never going to change. And I know it will at some point, but any models we should look at? Any states? You mentioned Pennsylvania a couple times. If you could put a little more color around that, it might be helpful, or maybe there's some others. Thanks.
Yeah, great question, David. I think you're going to start to see more, you know, you may already be involved with some public-private partnerships. I think you're going to start to see how institutions look at using their campuses differently, their real estate, their buildings differently, their real estate differently. And again, clearly depending on, as a public institution, you know, what you could do or couldn't do. But I think you're going to see campuses get redesigned. I think it'll be the campus will be used for vastly different things. And some might even argue, say it may be lightly aligned with education, but the use of we really have too much capacity, as you said, in the marketplace. So how do you get some kind of incremental contribution and get the right effective return on investment for the assets that you have? I think this is just starting to be looked at. I think you're going to see it happen with privates because they have probably a little bit more flexibility on what can happen. But I've sat through a webinar. I was a panelist, and it was put out by an architectural firm, which was talking about the whole redesign of a campus and looking at it much more comprehensively to be able to address the issue of just having too much real estate and having too many buildings and too much housing. And that might include building some additional things, but might be different for different use. But I think it's just starting to play itself out, David. And again, a good area for a plenary session, right, for a board. This would be a great topic to say, okay, let's a couple of months from now, let's try to look at what other states are doing, what other institutions are doing with their campuses and capacity. And so as you continue to have strategic plenaries, you'll be surprised on how far you get in terms of thinking very strategically about your own situation and where you want to go in terms of your long-term getting the sustainability and long-term prosperity.
Thanks, Rick. Cody, we'll look forward to your plenary session on capacity.
You'll need a lot of coffee. Ken, did I have you wanting to follow up on something?
Yeah, thank you, Cody. Just a couple of other quick points. I wanted to hop on Darren's point on indebtedness and the sort of the initiation of those programs, whatever, 30 years ago, and add to that. I think really, if you look at 2 things have happened over the last 30 years. One is that state support for for land grant institutions, state institution, has declined dramatically. And the reason it has is because of demographics. I mean, they had to really shift a lot of investment to pensions, healthcare, Medicare, these kind of. They just had to. And as one legislator said to me, we're not going to throw grandmother out in the snow. So there's been a very significant decline in state support, coupled with access to debt programs. And the end result is tuition is much higher and students are indebted. I don't know what you can do about that, but I mean, that is, I think the whole, to Dave's point, the whole cost thing is really a huge element here. The other thing I wanted to just underscore, and it is it's hard. My impression is it's hard for this industry to focus externally. I mean, we tend to be very, very internally focused on what we're doing in the here and now. And I think Rick's, most industries have to have a very high percentage of time looking at what's happening externally in the market and competitors, and it maybe leads to more speed and more agility. But maybe that's something that we could talk more about, how to bring a higher degree of just looking externally and studying the market could help us frame our approaches a little better.
So being a little more situationally aware.
Yeah, and really systematically looking externally. I mean, there've been a number of comments on what are the best ones, who are the benchmarks, and I know that we do it, and I know that our administration and they're into this, they're very current, they know what's happening. But I think as a board, our level of external kind of awareness of what's happening out there, and who's leading and where's, it's not something that we're able to focus on. And I would say that's unusual. Most industries spend a huge amount of time just looking at the competitive environment and the competitive set, and where's the innovation and who's doing something different, and can we learn from that? It's just hard, I think, for us with everything else that we have to do to have the bandwidth to do that. And it goes back to the 80% comment. I mean, if we could spend 80% of our time on strategic, on external, on what's happening, what are the most important. Of course, it'd be great if we could do that, but it's just very, very hard because of the complexity of the institution and the tactical things that we have to address.
Well, maybe as part of that plenary, we'll add to that the special purpose task groups, committees, et cetera, for purpose of exploring some of those things.
Maybe.
Darren, did you want to follow up?
Yes, thank you. And that's, Ken brings up a really important thought from my perspective, in that we talk about, the reduction in state support. And I think that there has, maybe as a percentage overall, the question is how much. And I think it'd be really helpful to have that data, because when I think about during previous service on this board, our budget was like 1.3 billion. And we were receiving hundreds of millions from the state. So, I mean, as a percentage, it was substantial. We're now, we receive more in actual dollars, but yet, tuition has gone up before adjustment for inflation by a factor of about 7. And so to kind of get an idea of what that actually is and where those pressure points are, I think would be helpful as we proceed. But the actual thing I wanted to ask Rick is, one of the challenges that we have with our system campuses outside of cities is that the marketplace has changed. And this is, I think, some of the subtext in what you've been discussing about the small liberal, other private colleges, liberal arts colleges, is the marketplace has changed. Part of it is the demographics have changed. A much larger percentage of our high school graduates are coming out of metropolitan areas or higher density areas, and fewer in rural areas where we're going to a small pastoral setting for college is not as attractive as maybe it was when we were a more agrarian society, and 80-90% of the population came from rural areas. So when we look at our system campuses, I'm interested in your thoughts. One of the concerns that I've had is that we tend to see these campuses as part of the university system, but really they're small regional colleges that are competing with the other regional colleges, including our surrounding states. And so, we've seen a decline in revenue because we've seen a decline in enrollment. But one of the challenges is our revenue, our tuition is substantially higher than the other publics just across the border. And, so it feels a little bit like, trying to sell one hammer for $1 million versus 1 million hammers for $1. And it's, to what extent are we able to deal with marginal cost of an additional student, but trying to bring down the overall tuition demand in order to ensure that we're not pricing ourselves out of a market that's been changing so dramatically?
Yeah, great question, Darren. I think that, yeah, in one regards, it almost, the campuses, or let's say the Duluth campus, whatever, it almost feels like it really is a private institution, right? It's out in the, it's in a rural community, and it has an X amount of cost structure. I think that this is definitely where you have to look at the cost of running that location. I'm not talking about keeping it open or closed, but I'm talking about, okay, doing things vastly different to lower the cost so you can be cost competitive in that area. So going back to shared services and different things, that's for starters. Those are the biggest challenges. See, that's kind of a significant challenges for say privates or even these regional campuses that are out there. And so if you say, okay, I want to keep it open, but how can we get it's now this point is how to get your cost structure down on that. And that is something that is definitely worthwhile looking at, but I think you have to do it through the lowering of costs, not cutting the costs. So cutting the costs, I was just going to not have as many student support people. Well, you might cut your costs there, but even lower your revenue further, but have to take a much more strategic approach to lowering the cost. Now, that will likely, haven't seen it yet where people embrace that, right? So it always comes with challenges, right? And the institutional will. But I think you need to think about that, about how do you bring about a permanency in the lowering of the cost. I think also, when Ken was talking about, the student debt, trying to be creative about how do you bend the cost curve for the student, and by thinking creatively about pathways, because the students are actually doing pathways themselves. They're choosing a community college for 2 years, going to a 4-year, or some are going into bypassing and going into certificates. So the whole concept of stackable certificates, credentials leading to a degree is an area of innovation that a number of colleges are working on. You can think about, hey, let's have a debt-free division. All right, now it might not be a BMW, but it might be a Chevy, and it might be, say, if you want a debt-free, here's the model here. But oftentimes what happens is that where the tension comes in is say, well, no, I don't want that debt-free. I want a BMW debt-free. Well, okay, I understand that. That's where the natural tension comes in. Well, let's figure out first how to get to Chevy debt-free so we can say we do have a debt-free alternative for students. And we're working, over time to continue to be progressive. But I think the areas of credentials, pathways for students, and different delivery mechanisms can help with lowering the overall cost for students. It comes back to also what David said about just over capacity. You just have a lot of other options when you start getting out to the rural areas.
If I can, Cody, if I can follow it, I think that's very helpful. And we had kind of a short conversation about enrollment yesterday, and it's true. There's a lot of capacity out there, and especially when you look at how some of these national universities are sucking up some of the demand, for higher ed. One of the challenges that we also face as a public board, representing people of the state, is that it's not just dollars and cents. Our value proposition also includes a relationship with the university for all corners of the state, and so having our system campuses around the state, that's an important part of us maintaining the public's support and the public's return from its land grant university. And so for me, it's always also taking a step back and saying, well, how do we balance this, the dollars and cents part of it with the fact that we have a mission that's very old and really dedicated toward this educating the next generation, along with the research and outreach that we do as an institution. But I appreciate you being here today. Thank you.
Yeah.
So we're running to the end of our relaxed period of time here, but Janie, I'm going to give you our last comment or question from the regents, and then Rick, if you want to provide any last parting words, that would be lovely.
Well, it occurred to me that one of the things is we look at our situation and where things are going, and particularly as we're looking for alternative sources of revenue, that I think one of the things that would be incumbent upon us is to look at what is our definition of a student. I mean, right now we tend to focus on those who have graduated from high school. Maybe they are 24 to 35, but I think of this as lifelong learning, and that there is an enormous population and opportunity out there of those who have been out for quite some period of time and are in fact looking for education that may lead to certificates or other things like that could be revenue generators. And thinking about focusing on the rest of our population, particularly in the state of Minnesota, who I think is very much wanting and needing for the labor market additional education to return to school for very focused learning opportunities. So one of the things I think we need to think about is broadening our definition of who our student target is, as opposed to our primary focus is those coming out of high school.
Thanks, Janie. And Rick, I'm going to have you hold for just 1 second. Mike, who's chair of our audit and compliance or audit committee, excuse me. I'll let you go quickly and then we'll have Rick tied up.
Appreciate it. Thank you very much. Thank you for the discussion and for setting it up, Cody. I was hearing Ken aptly spoke about the divestment in public education by the states specifically, and I mean that's certainly true. I've heard this notion out there, and that is not what Ken was saying, but I have heard people respond that as states divest, it somehow changes or shifts the obligation or the public nature of the university. For example, a while back, I remember discussing someone just in terms of what percentage of Minnesota students we should enroll and whatnot, and I was like, well, the state subsidizes them, and they said, yeah, but it used to be 2/3 and now it's flipped and it's 1/3. The way I think about that is to think that way would kind of be to forget and almost disrespect the history and what's happened since 1851, the actual land grant and all the funding ever since. I liken it to perhaps a young adult who's like, well, my parents no longer provide for me financially, so I really don't have any obligation to them. That kind of just ignores everything that happened before that and how you got to the point that you are. And obviously, we hope this trend doesn't continue and possibly even reverses. But even if it does continue, my sense is that because of the history, our public mission and I guess responsibilities to the state doesn't change so easily because of the divestment. I feel like it would take a very long time for that to be so. I'd just like your reaction to that, please. Thank you.
Well, history, you can't ignore history. And I think oftentimes the memories are short, right? So being able to continue to understand your mission, continue to understand kind of where we came from, right? And I think it also goes back down to the earlier comments about the public good. So I think that everything has to, when you think putting things in perspective and balance, and I understand when you talk about, hey, we used to get 2/3, now we get 1/3. Of course, many states are like that, and it's caused institutions to do different things, right? To focus in on out-of-state students, to focus in on a national market. But at the same time, you do have to bring that public good back in. So it is that tension and that balance between public good, financial integrity, serving the students and remembering where you came from.
Thank you.
It's okay.
All right, I'm going to allow one more before Brian kicks me under the table for for running over time here. So Ken, why don't you go ahead? And then
Okay, well,
Rick, I
thank you.
promise we'll let you tie it up.
Thank you. I was just going to say, anyway, I think very, very good discussion. I just want to acknowledge that we actually do have a very robust strategic plan. It's very aspirational. It, I think, will be the catalyst for a lot of innovation. The percentage of time as a board that we're focusing on strategic issues, I think, has gone up. And I'm not trying to be, Pollyanna here and everything's great, but I guess I think what Rick is saying is there's a lot of merit in what he's saying. And I think we're trying, I think we're moving in a good direction. Obviously, there's a lot more to do, but I do want to acknowledge that, the framing around strategy and innovation, by the new leadership team, I think has been quite positive in that regard.
Yeah, and I think that the importance of that movement continuing and not becoming stagnant or just allowing inertia to let us float along, but really taking the helm and pushing us to where we need to be, both as a board, as individuals on this board, and also to hold our administration to certain expectations as well in that process is really important. So Rick, I will let you wrap up this conversation with any parting words you care to share.
Just a thank you, Cody, to you and Ken for having me. I thought it was very productive conversation. And in one regard, you're running a marathon. So you have to really be thinking long-term and getting through, some of the bumps that our industry will have. But I think you're on the right path. You have such a great history. And I think you're taking the right approach by trying to look at what you have to do in a very comprehensive and strategic manner. So I just thank you so much. And if I can help you in the future, feel free to give me a call.
Thanks so much. We definitely know where to find you. Appreciate it, Rick.
Thank you. Thanks, Dave. I'll drop off now.
Great, thank you. Regent Powell, I figured I'd let you have the last word since any delay of this meeting really just delays your meeting.
Thank you.
So you'll only have yourself to blame. Our next item is action on the resolution related to policy amendments concerning the chief auditor. Executive Director Steves and Jason Langworthy, our board associate for policy and committees, are here to answer any final questions you might have. But Mr. Steves, would you please outline the changes that have been made since the September draft that was circulated?
Yes, Madam Chair, just as a reminder, there are a handful of amendments that were presented last month related to the chief auditor and that role, prompted by the transition of that role for the first time in 27 years. And following that meeting, there were some questions that were raised and some clarification sought around the direct or functional reporting relationship with the board and the dotted line or administrative reporting line to the president. And so there was some additional language added that seeks to just clarify and reinforce that those two relationships exist and will continue to exist going forward in this language. And so there are a couple sentences in Article 2, Section 5 that were added, and those are reflected in your docket.
Great. So before we start our discussion, is there a motion to recommend approval of the resolution related to policy amendments?
I'll move on it.
Second. Thank you. Before we start our full discussion on this, I did just want to share one comment. On the last day, on her last day as chief auditor here at the university, Chief Auditor Klatt reached out to me by phone and expressed her appreciation for adding this additional language to the policy. She felt it was important to emphasize the ad hoc administrative relationship between the chief auditor and the president. Well, the chief auditor will report to the board, and that is where that line is created. Chief Auditor Klatt expressed to me the importance of the relationship she has cultivated over the years with each of the presidents for which she served. It was those ad hoc relationships, those non-direct relationships that really gave her a line of sight into the activities of the university, identifying additional opportunities for improvement, being able to have those conversations. And really, as she put it, and her words were, it was her secret sauce. it was her secret sauce. It was the way she was able to keep a pulse of the university without it being the formal, strict relationship and reporting relationship to the board. And before I shared all of this, I asked her for her permission to share that. But as part of that importance in that relationship, as she saw it, and the fact that we have oversight over the president and her administration, we have this direct reporting relationship with the chief auditor. I'm going to ask as part of this, and as we go forward, now that we're memorializing some of these relationship pieces in the policy, that Regent Kenyanya as chair of audit and Regent Chair Powell as chair of our board keep us up to date on how this relationship is being cultivated once the chief auditor is hired, and how that relationship is developing, and where there might be opportunities to continue to maintain that as we go forward. So those are my comments, and I'll open it up for additional discussion. All right, well, I apologize. Regent Rocha.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a quick question, and I think that there's a lot of history here too in the way that it's worked for a number of years. I think that the improvements in the language, or the additions to the language, are improvements. I'm very impressed. I do have a question, and maybe we don't have the folks at the table to answer this, but I appreciate the opportunity for the auditor who works with the president, both each with a direct reporting relationship to the board. But how does that work with the cabinet? As far as when it says serve on the president's cabinet, how does that relationship work? Because I certainly think it makes a lot of sense for the president to be able to bring the chief auditor in to talk about key components of the university's operations. But is it kind of a formal thing? Is it more of an informal thing? How does that relationship develop over
time? President Gable.
Madam Chair, Regent Rocha, I apologize. I'm not sure what you're asking.
I think if I can maybe try and shortcut the language of the policy that was added is, by invitation, the chief auditor may serve on the president's cabinet. And I understand the question to be, how does that work? Is that an outreach by you to the chief auditor? How does the chief auditor interact then with the cabinet?
Well, thank you, Madam Chair, Regent Rocha. That remains to be seen. The cabinet is currently an unofficial organization of my direct reports.
All right, Madam Chair, that's good. The question kind of goes to, of course, maintaining the independence of the auditor, but also maximizing the value of the auditor. And if it's as the president just described, I think that seems reasonable that she would have that person participate in those dialogues and for the good of the university. Thank you.
Thanks, President Gable. Thanks, Regent Rocha. Anything additional? All right. There being no further discussion, it appears we're ready for a vote. So all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye. Aye.
All those opposed say no. All right, the motion is approved. All right, there being no additional business before the committee, we stand adjourned. Thank you to everyone.
And we will reconvene. It's 9:15 right now. We will reconvene in 15 minutes here at 9:30 for the regular meeting of the Board of Regents. Thank you.